It started with a garden gnome, a harmless, smiling little guy sitting peacefully in my front yard, until Karen saw him. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Armed with a clipboard, a scowl, and an obsession with pointless rules, she had made it her mission to control the entire neighborhood. And the moment she set her sights on me, I knew one thing for sure. This was war. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, an idyllic cookie-cutter suburb where lawns were trimmed, driveways were spotless, and everyone pretended to get along. It was the kind of place where people waved politely but secretly judged who left their trash bins out an extra hour. Among the rows of neatly aligned homes stood mine, an ordinary house with a small, well-maintained yard and a mailbox that had done nothing to offend anyone, until now. Because in this neighborhood, there was one unspoken rule. Karen ruled with an iron fist. Karen wasn't just a homeowner. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, the neighborhood's walking, talking rulebook who had somehow decided that it was her duty to keep the community in order. Armed with a clipboard, a scowl, and an unhealthy obsession with HOA guidelines, Karen made it her personal mission to ensure that no one had a second of joy that wasn't pre-approved. I first encountered her wrath on a perfectly normal Saturday morning. I had just stepped outside, coffee in hand, enjoying the breeze when I noticed her standing at the end of my driveway, glaring. Her arms were crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself back from physically tackling my mailbox. "Excuse me," she barked. I blinked. "Ah, morning." Her eyes narrowed. "Your grass is too long." I glanced down at my perfectly trimmed lawn. If anything, it was a model for how grass should aspire to be. "It's within regulation," I said. Karen sniffed. "It looks a little over." I stared at her, waiting for her to say she was joking. She wasn't. "Oh, and that," she continued, pointing a bony finger at my garden gnome, a harmless, smiling little guy who had lived there for months without incident. HOA rules state that decorative ornaments must be in good taste. I blinked again. "It's a gnome. An unauthorized gnome," she corrected, as if I had committed some heinous crime against suburban decor. "You'll have to remove it." It was at this moment that I realized Karen wasn't just a mildly annoying neighbor. She was a force of nature. And like a storm that had been gathering power for years, she was about to unleash pure, unfiltered HOA chaos. That day was just the beginning, because once Karen set her sights on you, she never let go. The next morning, I stepped outside to find a crisp white envelope taped to my front door. The HOA logo was printed in the corner, but I already knew who was behind it. Opening it, I read the violation notice. Infraction, unauthorized lawn ornament. Corrective action, immediate removal. Deadline, 48 hours. At the bottom, in small print, was the signature, Karen H., HOA Compliance Coordinator. I stared at the letter, half expecting cameras to zoom in from hidden locations as part of some elaborate prank. But no, this was real. The woman had actually put it in writing. Over a garden gnome. As I read the letter, movement caught my eye across the street. There she was, Karen, standing in her yard, clipboard in hand, watching. Waiting. Like a villain in a low-budget sitcom. I gave her a little wave. She did not wave back. Instead, she clicked her pen and started writing something. That's when I knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a full-blown power trip. Later that day, I heard from Tom, my next-door neighbor. He was shaking his head as he walked over, holding a nearly identical notice. "She got me for a single leaf on my driveway," he said. I squinted. "A single leaf?" He turned the paper around. Infraction, yard debris was written in bold letters. "I swear to you, I saw her standing on the sidewalk just staring at it," Tom muttered. Hands on her hips, like she was waiting for it to move on its own. At first, I thought it was funny. Karen playing dictator over the most trivial things. But then came the next complaint. And the next. By the end of the week, my mailbox had received 3 separate notices. First, for my grass allegedly being too long, which I measured to prove it was well within regulations. Then, for not having my trash bins pulled in fast enough after pickup day. And finally, the most absurd one yet, for having my car parked in my own driveway. Apparently, I had committed the egregious crime of excessive vehicle presence. I laughed when I read it, but that laughter faded quickly when I noticed Karen standing on the sidewalk once again, watching me. She had that same tight-lipped expression, that same disapproving gaze, like a school principal waiting for a student to confess. It was then that I realized something chilling. Karen wasn't going to stop. I decided to take the high road. At first, After all, how bad could one overly enthusiastic HOA enforcer really be? I figured if I complied with her ridiculous demands, she'd move on to terrorize some other poor soul. So I played along. I trimmed my already trimmed grass. I pulled in my trash bins with record-breaking speed. I even, begrudgingly, moved my garden gnome to the backyard, where he could live in exile away from Karen's judgmental gaze. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the next notice. Infraction. Mailbox needs repainting. I stared at it, dumbfounded. My mailbox was fine. It was the same shade of dull beige as every other mailbox on the street. But Karen had apparently decided it wasn't up to standard. I caught her in the act later that afternoon, clipboard in hand, inspecting my property with the intensity of a detective solving a murder case. "Karen," I called out. She turned, eyes narrowing like she had been expecting confrontation. "Yes, my mailbox is fine." "It's fading," she replied, as if she had uncovered a major scandal. "It's starting to look worn." I looked at it. If there was any fading, I sure as hell couldn't see it. "I'll get right on that," I said dryly. She squinted at me, clearly sensing my sarcasm, but unable to outright call me on it. And so, I painted the mailbox. But not just any paint. I made damn sure it was the exact shade as before. I even color-matched it at the hardware store just to be petty. 2 days later, another letter arrived. Infraction, mailbox paint, incorrect shade. I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Karen wasn't just on a power trip. She was on a warpath. I tried reasoning with her. I told her I had matched the color perfectly. She gasped like I had suggested repainting it neon green. "It's close, but it's not the exact shade." I stared at her. "Karen, do you have an official HOA color swatch?" She hesitated. "I don't need one. I know what it's supposed to look like." That's when I knew I had 2 choices. Continue playing by Karen's nonsense rules or fight back. I decided to fight back. But subtly. I started small. I followed every rule. Every single one. But to the absolute, ridiculous letter. If the HOA guidelines said trash bins needed to be removed promptly, I set a stopwatch and pulled mine in the second the truck left. If grass had to be below 5 inches, I measured mine down to 4.99 inches and left a ruler in the yard for Karen to see. She was livid. She knew I was mocking her, but I wasn't technically breaking any rules. And that's when she escalated. It started with whispers. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but soon, I realized I wasn't alone in my silent war against Karen. Tom from next door was the first to confirm it. One evening, as I was pulling my trash bins and right on schedule, he strolled over, shaking his head. "She's losing it," he muttered. "Karen? Who else?" He glanced over his shoulder, lowering his voice. "She knocked on my door yesterday. Said my Christmas lights were up too early." I frowned. "It's November." "Exactly." He crossed his arms. "HOA rules say no decorations before December 1st. So I checked. Turns out she had her stupid wreath up last week." I let out a short laugh. The irony was too perfect. "She's going too far," Tom continued. "And people are talking." He wasn't wrong. That weekend, I ran into Sarah from across the street while getting my mail. She leaned in like we were in some kind of underground resistance movement. "Did she get you for the grass thing?" she asked. "Yep." She rolled her eyes. "She sent me a violation for my doormat." "Your doormat?" "Apparently, it's too expressive." I had to bite back a laugh. "What does that even mean?" She said HOA-approved mats should be neutral and welcoming. She raised an eyebrow. "Mine says go away." Now I did laugh. "Okay, that's pretty great." She grinned. I left it there out of spite. The more I talked to people, the more stories I heard. Karen had terrorized the neighborhood for years, but this was the first time people were openly pushing back. It was becoming HOA versus Karen. And Karen knew it. The clipboard was coming out more often. She patrolled the sidewalks like a security guard, watching. One evening, I saw her staring at my house for a full 5 minutes, jotting things down like she was building a case. Then it happened. Tom texted me at 10 p.m. "Dude." She called the HOA emergency line. "About your porch light." I stared at my phone. "The what?" Before I could even respond, my doorbell rang. Standing there, arms crossed, was Karen. "It's too bright," she announced. I blinked. "What?" "The HOA regulations state that porch lights must be a reasonable brightness." I glanced at my normal, standard porch light, then back at her. "It's a light bulb, Karen." She held up her clipboard. It's disruptive to the neighborhood ambience. I resisted the urge to slam the door in her face. I'm not changing my porch light. She narrowed her eyes. Then I'll have to file an official complaint. The way she said it, you'd think she had just delivered some kind of death sentence. Go ahead, I said. Make it official. That was the moment I saw it, the first flicker of panic in her eyes. Because for the first time, someone wasn't backing down. The next morning, I woke up to find Karen had completely lost it. There she was, standing on my lawn, a tape measure in hand, bent over, measuring my grass. I stood in my doorway, coffee in hand, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't seen me yet. She was too focused, lips pursed, eyes scanning my yard like she was conducting some high-stakes forensic investigation. Finally, I cleared my throat. Karen, what the hell are you doing? She jumped and whirled around, trying to act like this was a normal thing to do at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. She hesitated, realizing how insane she looked. I'm checking compliance. For what exactly? The height of your grass. I stared at her. I cut it yesterday. Well, she said stiffly, it looks too long. It's 4.99 inches. Her jaw clenched. It's supposed to be under 5 inches. It is under 5 inches. Karen's eye twitched. She looked down at her tape measure like she was considering arguing with basic math. That was when Tom walked by with his morning coffee. He stopped, took in the scene, and let out a loud laugh. Measuring grass now, Karen? Karen turned bright red. This is important for neighborhood standards. Tom shook his head. You've officially lost it. She huffed, yanked her tape measure back, and stormed off toward her house. But as she did, she shouted over her shoulder. You'll be hearing from the HOA. She wasn't bluffing. By noon, I had another violation notice, this time for lack of community spirit. Lack of community spirit. I sat on my porch, holding the letter in disbelief. Tom walked over, peering at it. What does that even mean? He asked. I shook my head. Apparently, my failure to maintain a welcoming aesthetic is disruptive to neighborhood unity. Tom laughed. She's making this up now. She's desperate, I said. She knows she's losing. And she was. The neighbors were starting to turn against her. At the next HOA meeting, people started complaining about Karen instead of each other. Sarah stood up. I'd like to formally ask why I got a violation for my doormat. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Tom added, and why did I get fined because my cat trespassed on her lawn? Someone else shouted. She knocked on my door to say my pumpkins were too large. Karen sat stiffly in her chair, clutching her clipboard like it was a life raft. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy looks. It was happening. The Karen empire was starting to collapse. Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She could feel the shift. The once silent compliance of the neighborhood was cracking, and for the first time, she was losing control. So she did what any self-proclaimed HOA queen would do. She doubled down. The next morning, I saw her pacing up and down the street, clipboard in hand, writing violation notices like her life depended on it. Everyone got one. Tom got another warning about his cat trespassing. Sarah got a double violation, one for her doormat and a new one for her excessively loud wind chimes. Someone else got a fine for having their car too dusty. And then, Karen made her fatal mistake. She broke her own rules. I hadn't even noticed at first. But Tom, ever the neighborhood watchdog, when it came to Karen, spotted it. Come with me, he said, grinning. We walked 2 houses down, stopping right in front of Karen's perfectly curated yard. And there it was, her holiday wreath. A big, obnoxious red and green monstrosity. It was November. HOA rules clearly stated that holiday decorations weren't allowed until December 1st. Holy hell, I whispered. She's violating her own rules. Tom nodded. And she doesn't even realize it. We took pictures, documented the evidence. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the room was packed. Word had spread. Karen had been on a power trip for too long, and people were ready to fight back. I stood up first. I'd like to address a violation. Karen smirked. Of course. What now? I smiled. Your own violation. Her smirk vanished. I pulled out the printed evidence. HOA regulations state that holiday decorations are not permitted until December 1st. And yet, here's a photo of your wreath, up 3 weeks early. Karen turned bright red. The HOA board members leaned in. She knew the rule. She wrote the rule. I continued, if I'm getting violations for my lawn, for my mailbox, for my porch light, Then I assume the rules apply to everyone, correct? Silence. Then, one of the board members finally spoke. Karen, is this true? Karen sputtered. It's different. I was. But there was no getting out of it. She was caught. And just like that, the tides turned. One by one, the neighbors started listing their grievances. Tom's cat violations. Sarah's wind chimes. The pumpkins. The porch lights. The sheer insanity of it all. And then, the HOA president made the final call. Karen was removed from her position. The clipboard, the symbol of her reign of terror, was taken from her. And as if the universe wanted to seal the deal, she was handed a fine. For her own violation. The look on her face was pure defeat. For the first time in HOA history, Karen had no power. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Karen was done. No more clipboard patrols. No more random violations. No more measuring people's grass at sunrise. For the first time in years, people could relax in their own homes without the looming threat of a passive-aggressive note taped to their door. And Karen? Well, at first, she tried to act like nothing had changed. She still walked the street with her usual judgmental glare, but now, instead of fear, she was met with smirks and suppressed laughter. Because without her title, without her fake authority, she was just another neighbor. Then one day she was gone. The house went up for sale. Rumors spread. Some said she couldn't handle living in a neighborhood where people weren't terrified of her anymore. Others said she ran off to another HOA to start over. Either way, Karen was no more. And the neighborhood? It thrived. People decorated however they wanted. Sarah got a new doormat that said, "Not today, Karen." Tom put up a wooden cutout of his cat on his lawn, just to be petty. And me? I brought the gnome back, right in the front yard. And I swear, in the days after she left, the air just felt lighter. No more random violations. No more unnecessary fines. No more petty complaints. Just peace. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood actually felt like home. If you enjoyed watching Karen's downfall and love HOA drama, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to HOA Havoc. Police Scarlight, we've got more insane neighborhood stories coming your way, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. House with Garden Fire. And let me know in the comments, what's the pettiest HOA rule you've ever encountered? Eyes backhand index pointing down.